Hi! Do you struggle with your fabric fraying in your sewing projects? Don't know how to enclose seams? Do you ever wonder if the edge of your fabric is just going to eventually unravel? Do your sewing projects look like this? Well, stick around because I'm going to cover 9 ways to prevent fraying and enclose seams with just using a regular sewing machine. So one misconception is that a serger is needed to really attain that professional finish and be able to enclose seams and finish raw edges nicely and cleanly. But that's actually not true. Raw edges can be finished and seams can be enclosed using a regular sewing machine. So the first method is a zigzag stitch. This can actually be used either to pre-treat the edges of your fabric or to enclose seams. This is a great option because the zigzag stitch is available on almost every machine, so it doesn't matter what type of machine you have, whether it's mechanical or computerized, or the level of advancement. So it should be an option for everyone. In order to pre-treat the edge of your fabric, when sewing, just line up your fabric and the outer edge of the zigzag stitch where the needle either hits the very edge of the fabric or just over the fabric so that it catches the end and encloses that edge. When finishing seams, place your fabric together, sew them together with the seam allowance as normal, and then run it back through the machine using the zigzag stitch on the edge in the same way. So another method is with the use of an overcasting presser foot and an overedge stitch. In my opinion, this is actually one of the better ways to finish raw edges and enclose seams without a serger. However, this may be limited to more advanced machines. The advantage of the overcasting presser foot and overedge stitch is that it allows you to closely mimic the way a serger finishes seams. Overedge stitches sew the seam and enclose the edge all in one step, similar to the way a serger works. As with the zigzag stitch, the overedge stitch and the overcasting presser foot can be used to pre-treat fabric to prevent fraying. It can also be used to finish seams while preventing fraying simultaneously. It can also be used to strengthen seams even when fraying is not a concern. So if you invest in a machine that has the overcasting presser foot and the capability of the overedge stitch, you can potentially accomplish all of your sewing needs in just one machine. You can get pretty close to the functions of a serger without having to incur the additional cost of a second machine. The third way is AntiFray Liquid. AntiFray Liquid can prevent fraying on fabric. It is a clear liquid sealant, kind of like a glue, that prevents fabric from fraying and secures thread. It stays clear when it's dry and it is soft and flexible, so there's no need to worry about your fabric getting stiff. It typically comes in the form of a squeezable bottle. Some brands promote it as washable and dry cleanable. It can be removed, however, in the event of unwanted spots with rubbing alcohol, although I've never tried this. Regardless of whether or not you utilize other methods to prevent fraying and enclose seams, AntiFray Liquid can be an invaluable tool to have in your sewing room. Personally, I frequently use it to stop fraying at corners or other difficult to reach places. I also use it to finish the edges of cutouts and applique. I use Dritz Frayed Chip, which also happens to be one of the most popular and widely available brands. It's easy to use and washable and dry cleanable. Now, most of my projects are actually accessories that don't tend to get washed very much, but I have used it on a shirt that gets washed and it seems to be holding up pretty well. If you'd like to give it a try, I'll put a link down to it in the description below. As with anything that you're putting on fabric, it should definitely be tested on a scrap piece of fabric before you use it on your project. While in most instances using AntiFray Liquid hasn't left any stains or discoloration, at least not the AntiFray Chip, I have had it leave a darker spot. It kind of makes it look like the fabric is wet if I use too much of it in the same spot. In addition to the regular cone tip, which is good for spots, some packages also come with a fabric applicator guide. This comes with 2 sides that you can place the fabric in between so that you can more easily guide it along the edge of fabric. The ingredients in the Dritz Anti-Fray Check include N-propanol and nylon terpolymer, not sure if I said that right, which is used as a binder in synthetic fibers, and water. If you'd like to know more about what each of these ingredients are, please check out the blog post, which is linked in the description below. The fourth option is to use either a scalloped rotary cutter or pinking shears. Pinking shears are specialized scissors that have a serrated or sawtooth-like edge that cuts the fabric on the bias, which prevents fraying.
Note, if you buy pinking shears, please make sure they are designed for fabric. A lot are designed for paper and they will not cut your fabric.
An alternative to pinking shears is a scalloped rotary cutter. What's a rotary cutter, you may ask? Well, a rotary cutter uses a handle and then it has a circular blade which cuts the fabric as it rotates. A scalloped rotary cutter is similar to a regular rotary cutter, except instead of a smooth blade, it has a scalloped edge that mimics the function of pinking shears. It creates a zigzag edge along the fabric, which prevents fraying. Now, if you already have a regular rotary cutter, you can just get scalloped replacement blades to put on the one you already have. Or you can buy a full rotary cutter with scalloped blades, like this one. Some rotary cutters come with a mix of smooth blades and scalloped blades. So which is better, pinking shears or a scalloped rotary cutter? Well, that's entirely a matter of preference. Personally, I like to use the scalloped rotary cutter because I feel like it's much sharper. It seems to cut smoother, and I also find it easier because it just cuts in one smooth rotation instead of having to like open and close scissors each time. Plus, I think it's easier to maintain a straight line for the same reason. So if you're interested in getting a scalloped rotary cutter, where can you get one? Well, they're surprisingly difficult to find in stores, so if you want one, you may want to check online. I use the Auto Tool Home scalloped rotary cutter, and I love it. Like most rotary cutters, it has a safety blade which locks the blade against the back plastic when not in use to prevent you from accidentally cutting yourself or something else. The retractable lever on the handle rotates the blade out for use, but slides the blade back into place when you let go. It comes with 10 blades, 5 are scallop blades, and 5 are regular smooth blades. It's extremely sharp, which you want, of course, when you're cutting fabric, but because it's so sharp, I haven't had to replace the blade since I've gotten it, which has been nearly 3 years now. If you're interested in this rotary cutter, I'll put a link in the description down below. Other types can potentially be found at Joann's or Michael's. The fifth alternative is bias tape. Bias tape is a strip of fabric that has been cut along the bias. Bias is the 45-degree angle along the weave of the fabric. Strips cut along the bias are pieced together to create one long tape. Not only do strips cut on the bias not fray, but they are also stretchier and more flexible than fabric cut on the grain. On the grain refers to cutting fabric in the direction it was woven. Woven fabric is a fabric made by interlacing 2 or more threads at right angles. Bias tape ranges in size, meaning width and length, and it can either be single fold or double fold. Single fold bias tape has each edge of the fabric folded toward the center one time, like this. Double fold bias tape also has the edge of the fabric folded towards the center, but in this case it's folded over twice to completely enclose the raw edge. You can either purchase ready-made bias tape like this, or you can make your own. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. Largely, it depends on the project as well as how much time you have as to which option is better / which one you should choose. I use both ready-made and homemade bias tape depending on the project and the circumstance. The advantages of ready-made bias tape is that it can save a lot of time. It also adds a lot of ease and convenience. Typically made of a polyester cotton blend, it has a sleek texture that adds a professional finish to projects. Commercial bias tape is also typically very strong. Disadvantages include that you will most likely find it limited to solid colors, although I did see rainbow ones. You may not find the best solid color match, and it may not match as good as homemade bias tape that is either made from the same fabric or coordinating fabric with your project. Also, it can be a little stiffer than regular fabric or homemade bias tape. This can sometimes make it difficult to go around a curve without it puckering. It can also be expensive. The amount per pack is not as economical as I would like, and it doesn't get as far in the project as I tend to need it to be. Now, as far as making your own bias tape, similarly, there are advantages and disadvantages. So one of the advantages of making your own bias tape is that you can make it in any color or print that you want, and you can make it an exact match to your project if you like. It can be a little more flexible and versatile, particularly around curves, which eliminates unwanted puckers. Furthermore, it is often cheaper because you can make it from fabric that you already have instead of having to purchase something separate. Plus, you only have to make as much as you like or need. Disadvantages include that it can add some time to your project. Even with a bias tape maker, it can still take some time to make your own bias tape. Also, it sometimes wastes fabric due to the fact that you have to cut at a diagonal across the fabric, preferably the longest part, in order to reduce the amount of fabric that you have to cut and the pieces that you have to attach together. The alternative here is piecing a bunch of little pieces together. Personally, I don't like to waste fabric, so I will often start with the center and then work my way out towards the fabric to utilize as much of the fabric as possible, even if that means that there are a lot of attachment points. The other disadvantage to homemade bias tape is that it can sometimes lack that sleek and professional finish that commercial bias tape can give. This is largely due to the texture and material differences of the ready-made bias tape and homemade bias tape. This does, of course, depend on what material you choose. Now let me know in the comments below if you'd like to know how to make your own bias tape. Not ready to make your own? Or does the ease and convenience of having ready-made bias tape sound like more your style? That's okay too. Either way, you can check the link in the description below to find some ready-made bias tape options. Hemming tape is another alternative to prevent fraying and help finish a raw edge. Hemming tape is a thin strip of heat-activated webbing. It comes on a tape roll like this. Hemming tape is placed between 2 layers of fabric and ironed in place, thus securing the edges of the fabric while bonding to the sticky tape. Note, please be sure to pre-wash any fabric prior to using hemming tape. Hemming tape will minimize fraying in most fabrics.
Also, just a note, it's a real time saver when you're trying to hem something. When hemming tape is an option, I would definitely use it. Game changer in terms of ease and time.
Although any brand of hemming tape will work well, I find the Heat and Bond brand to work particularly well. It's easy to use, it's adequately sticky, and by that I just mean that it holds to the fabric pretty well, and it holds up pretty well over time. I'll put the link to that in the description below. Another option to prevent fraying and enclose the raw edge is through use of a rolled hem foot. While it may be limited to a more advanced machine, it's a great option for soft, light, or medium weight fabrics because it rolls the edge of the fabric underneath this piece and folds the edge underneath the fabric as it sews, fully encasing the raw edge. To utilize a small one like this, it is necessary to first press the fabric twice. You press the fabric once and then fold it in on itself again and press it again. After double folding the edge of the fabric, you can run the fabric through this loop on the presser foot while sewing a straight stitch to fully enclose the edge of the fabric. For an alternative look, you can also utilize a zigzag stitch. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that personally, I find this foot that came with my machine to be a little difficult to use. I also typically sew primarily with cotton or quilting cotton, which is not suitable for this foot because this one is primarily geared for use with fabrics such as maybe organza or silk, and they're a little harder to press and keep in place. Because of the challenges in using the smaller rolled hem foot, that's why I purchased this larger rolled hem foot set from Madame Sew. It has 3 sizes and comes with a larger rectangular rolled hem section that allows me to sew a rolled hem without having to press or pin the fabric down prior to running it through the machine. Like the other rolled hem foot, except more effective due to its size, it turns the fabric under twice and stitches it down, eliminating the 2 pressing steps. With this pack, you get neat wide hems at the size you want, which includes a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1 inch. Use of a rolled hem foot is a huge time saver and can be utilized in a variety of project types. Another advantage to Madame Sew's 3-piece set is that it is specifically designed for medium weight fabrics. You can use a zigzag or other decorative stitches, and it doesn't need a corner or a straight edge. You can also use it on a curve or a tube. Although personally I've not tried that, but according to the instructions, you can. Now, similar to a rolled hem foot or a hem in general, a double fold is another way to enclose a raw edge or finish a seam. You can achieve this by folding the fabric towards the wrong side of the fabric, the unfinished side of the fabric, once, pressing it, and then folding it in on itself a second time. Then sew that down close to the edge so that the raw edge is contained within the fold. The 9th and final option, at least of today's video, is enclosed seams. Enclosed seams are seams that enclose the raw edges and the seam allowance within the seam. Not only are enclosed seams a great way to enclose raw edges, but they are also ideal for garment construction because the seam is concealed on both the inside and outside of the garment, which ensures more comfort for the skin. Enclosed seams also provide neatness and stability and are very strong. 3 types of enclosed seams include the flat felled seam, a French seam, and an overlapping seam. A flat felled seam is a strong seam that is typically used for heavyweight fabrics. This type of seam encases the raw edge of the seam allowance. To sew this seam, you start by putting the wrong sides of the fabric together and sewing a straight stitch along the raw edge with a roughly 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, press the seam open so that it lays flat. Then, you trim one side of the seam down with scissors and leave about 1/8 or 1/4 inch left, and leave the other side as it is. After this, you take the larger side of the seam, which you did not touch, and fold it over the shorter seam, which was just cut, until the shorter seam is fully encased within the fold. Then pin it in place. To finish the seam, sew down the edge that was just folded over. Try to get as close to the edge of the seam as possible. Unlike a flat felled seam, a French seam is typically used for lightweight fabrics due to its bulky nature. To sew this seam, start by placing the wrong sides of the fabric together and sew down the edge of the fabric with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, press the seam to one side. To ensure that the seam lies flat, it is necessary to use an iron, and it is recommended that you press both sides of the fabric. Now, with the wrong sides of the fabric facing down and the seam on top, fold one side of the fabric onto the other. This will be over the seam. The wrong sides of the fabric should be facing out now. Press along the edge of the fabric with the seam. Next, sew down the seam with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After this, to finish the seam, press the seam to one side to ensure that it lies flat. And finally, the last method is an overlapping seam. An overlapping seam is an easier mock flat felled seam that is typically used for heavyweight fabrics. To start, take a fabric marker or pencil or chalk and mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the top or right side of one section of fabric. Next, line the other section of fabric up to the line on top of the fabric that was just marked. Next, sew down the fabric along the edge where the 2 fabric pieces meet. Sew as close to the mark that was made as possible. After this, sew down the same side about 3/8 of an inch away from the line that was just sewn to finish the seam. Well, there you have it. 9 ways to prevent fraying and finish seams without a serger. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. See you next time. I use Dritz Fray Trick. I use Dritz Fray Trick. Why do I keep saying? And wildly available. Which doesn't fray. Single faux, instead of a smooth blade, it has a blade with a jagged edge. Hey, I thought you might want to know what a regular rotary cutter is. A scalloped rotary cutter is similar to a normal rotary cutter.